aus den Urdirektiven der spanischen Hofreitschule. Vom Pferde. Unter allen Tieren der Welt ist das Pferd das alleredelste, nützlichste und vortrefflichste, denn keines dem Menschen mehr dienet als dieses. Ich will hier nicht die alten Skribenten anführen, die uns in ihren Büchern dem Pferd unvergleichliche Taten zum ewigen Gedächtnis hinterlassen. Nur von dem gemeinsten Mann anfangen, und bis zum König und Kaiser hingehen, wo es die Dienst- und Nutzbarkeit eines Pferdes, in allen Begebenheiten, auf das Allerwundersamste finden werde.
In 1898, Feldmarschallleutnant von Holbein wrote the so-called Directives, the general guidelines for the training of horse and rider at the Imperial Royal Spanish Riding School, together with chief rider Johann Meixner. They have been made available to a larger audience by Dr. Berthold Schurg, who included them as an appendix in his edition of an 18th-century manuscript entitled Unknown Texts from the Spanish Riding School, Ohms Press 1996. It also contains the original guidelines, which as the author ascribed to Edler von Regenthal around 1720, and which were only found after the fire in the National Library in Vienna. It describes the tasks of the Imperial Royal Spanish Riding School as follows. First, to preserve the equestrian art in its highest perfection, the high school, and, while allowing for today's views and needs, continually to promote higher horsemanship, whose principles and experiences still form the basis for modern riding, even today. Second, educating methodical school riders, and training the necessary school horses. Third, testing the horse material of an independent breeding program that is at the disposal of the Imperial Royal Spanish Riding School, in terms of the durability of the bones, joints, and muscles, as well as temperament and character, with a view to using certain individual for breeding purposes. Fourth, teaching lessons, as far as this is reconcilable with the education of the riders and the training of the school horses, to individual persons from the army, or civilians, who are interested in equestrian art. About the riding system, that is to be applied at the court riding school, the following. Advanced horsemanship must never be conceptualized as haute école, in isolation, since it comprises all three types of riding. 1. Riding with as natural a posture of the horse as possible, not in collection, and on straight lines, the so-called riding forward. Basical school. 2. Riding the collected horse in all gaits, turns and patterns in perfect balance. Campaign school. 3. Riding the horse in an artistically elevated posture, with increased flexion of the haunches, and regularity, maneuverability, and dexterity, in all ordinary, as well as nature-oriented extraordinary gaits and leaps, brought methodically to the highest perfection. This type of riding is called high school.
Yesterday, at the turn of the year 2021, I watched the broadcast from the Spanish riding school, and it just made me sad to see that it was not more than a bad copy of what you could experience there in around the 90s. Even basic criteria for the training of rider and horse were often no longer met, which used to be a matter of course in this institution. For me, the classic work at the SRS was of immense importance in order to understand the training of the riding horse and to be able to implement it myself, in comparison to this amateurish, but in the pursuit of correctness. I had wonderful teachers and interlocutors from the SRS who helped me to see and understand the importance of a classical training path according to the SRS directives. Above all, that this path is in complete harmony with the latest findings in psychomotor and biomechanics as well as physiological training theory. And also, that you can see a lot in the horse's movement pattern and what influence small things can already have on the mental and physical flow of movement and movement planning of the horse, and thus also on its well-being as a movement animal. If this path, as has unfortunately happened there at the SRS since from 2001, is consciously abandoned, and training techniques are introduced that counteract the classic criteria, and also no longer attention is paid to many small things, then what is actually the task is lost. This institution should be to preserve the classical art of riding, and to show it, in order to get the picture in the heads of all viewers, as it can look like if we meet what is called the classical art of riding. This creates an image that every rider strives for, and which can help and inspire at every level, even if you will never reach the final state. The path is then the goal, and it doesn't take shortcuts or concessions to other methods that don't fit. Because then the way does not lead to Rome, but you end up somewhere else. And that's exactly how it felt to me when I watched the video on television yesterday. Afterwards, I took out my old videos again to be able to visualize the image from the old times and the goal and the path again.
Colonel Hans Handler, director of the Spanish riding school, from 1964 until his death in 1974, warned years ago that by becoming a tourist attraction, the danger must not be overlooked, lest commercialization reduce it to a tourist business, with associated management and thereby the SRS was in danger to lose its worldwide importance as the sole remaining riding institute, in which the art of classical equitation has been maintained in its purest form, and the training directives, delivered in the oral tradition, could all too easily be lost. The Spanish riding school had to remain an institute for riders and horses. Its value lies in the standard displayed, which must be developed anew for each new trainee and horse. A line must be drawn where the standard starts to suffer, through overexertion of man and beast.
When a special law in 2001 changed the Spanish riding school to a partly privatized company that could act independently, though controlled by the state, it would not have led, in principle, to the current problems. Ultimately, the duties of the registered company, Spanish riding school and federal stud piper, remain the same as before. The long-term conservation and traditional breeding of the Lipizzaner horse, and the pursuance and preservation of the high school of classical horsemanship, as well as the historic tradition of the Spanish riding school.
The Spanish riding school in Vienna has survived 2 world wars and several other catastrophes since its founding in 1565. Unfortunately, it seems that the 450th anniversary celebration in 2015 already had raised the awareness as to have been seen as a farewell performance to traditional Viennese classical horsemanship. We hear more and more criticism of the market-oriented exploitation of the school and the associated state stud at Piber. In recent years, we can see it's creeping towards bad, modern dressage. The consequences: in place of school stallions, trained to the highest level, with patience and respect, who dance in harmony with their riders, exhibiting the brilliance and expression of the high school, we see pictures that have been around for years, quite rightly, the sport.
Since Elizabeth Gertler took over the directorship of the Spanish riding school in 2007, the requirement for public performance was dramatically increased. The number of school stallions were almost doubled, whilst at the same time staff numbers, especially riding and teaching specialists, were reduced. Increased performance from fewer staff of experts might work where technology can replace the human workforce. Horses and riders, though, are not computer-controlled machines, whose performance level can be arbitrarily enhanced. What this would mean for the equestrian grassroots in Vienna, I first experienced in May 2008, in the Berghof Café, with its view of the outdoor training arena, in the courtyard of the Viennese Imperial City Castle. Photos resulted, which would trigger an internet storm some years later, although the inherent problems they revealed could be verified by more recent evidence. The pictures in this video are from 2008 to 2020, and are, by no means, snapshots. You see stallions, ridden in Rollkur manner, with necks rolled up to their chest and flexed, meeting the definition of so-called hyperflexion, or LDR, low, deep and round training techniques. I have seen this hyperflexion in the competitive riding scene. I had already given this far from horse-friendly method considerable consideration since 2002. Its mental and physical consequences are nowadays scientifically verifiable. I was appalled to see this sort of riding, but awaited a correction. When this did not happen, I photographed what I saw in front of me. During morning exercise and performances, on this day and in the years up to 2013, in amongst correct riding, I noticed much, which varied from sloppy seat, excessive assistance, senseless punishment, to the employment of positions, tempos and actions, which in classical riding conflict with its goal, and its respect for the horse partner. Flexion and hyperflexion. The term flexion comes from the Latin word for bending. Hyperflexion means extreme bending of one or several joints, which can lead to these joints being damaged. Hyperflexion is known internationally as the Rollkur training method. Here the horse's neck is consciously shortened and overflexed between the second and fourth neck vertebrae. Additionally, the horse is positioned or flexed too far to the side. Tendons, muscle groups and ligaments get overstretched. Rolling the neck and flexing are only some aspects of so-called modern dressage training methods being used today in sport, not working according to classical principles. A new, less bad-sounding name for THS training's technique is LDR, low, deep and round. But even applied under this name, or in a moderate way, riding a horse with the wrong bend, shortened neck, and behind the vertical, the back and hindquarters are blocked, and it has very detrimental effects on the physical and mental well-being of the horse. The whole flow of movement from hindquarters to the mouth of the horse changes. This is why such methods, already having been applied earlier in history of horsemanship, always have been rejected by the Spanish riding school. From the point of view of nowadays psychomotricism, classical training, that is correct for the partner horse, is a systematic path, leading to a dialogue in motion between horse and rider. As in a dance, there is a leading partner and a following partner. In the ideal case, both partners have equal joy in floating across the floor. Both listen to one another, both consider the other, and both enjoy achieving coordinated motion. This has been the goal of the classical equestrian art. Classically correct riding instruction can still achieve it. The partner that is led, the horse, should enjoy being ridden, and become a work of art, in terms of mental and physical development, at the ideal of the traditional classical art of riding. In classical philosophy, horse and rider become one. They melt into each other, as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe described it. Mythology presents this with the picture of the centaur, horse and man in one body. But the rider shouldn't become the dominant head. The horse should be allowed to think as well. His contribution should be respected and valued. In the ideal, they decide together what must be done next, although the rider provides the direction, and the horse takes this direction and translates it into movement, out of his own desire. The horse can also make suggestions, which are usually reasonable, since the horse is the best judge of what movement is technically possible, and what isn't. In this way, the horse can help the rider, and the rider the horse, in accomplishing movement exercises. If we compare this ideal with training techniques, such as LDR, hyperflexion, Rollkur, then we see that, in addition to the characteristic neck positions, a number of psychological and physical aspects play a very unpleasant role for the horse when these techniques are practiced. Since hyperflexion leads to a changed appearance in movement and muscle formation, to loss of balance, harmony, and of the confidence in hand and seat, the consequences with individual stallions were not unnoticed. Defective development of the top line, hip, and backs blocked by shortening of the neck, the flexing of the haunches and true collection prevented. Contact problems from no longer wanting to accept the reins, to using the tongue to protect from the bit, in stallions whose activity is dull and listless. I could no longer see the power, developed from suppleness and collection, during the physical and mental balance, that I used to marvel at in the school jumps. Mediocre airs above the ground were performed, with extremely short engagement, and overexcited stallions. I shared my observations in 2008 with Georg Wahl, former Viennese chief rider, who died in November 2013, and his partner Christine Stuckelberger, Olympic dressage rider. Both, like me, held that Spanish riding school dear to their heart. They too has seen what I had. Because of their good contacts, I placed the Rollkur relevant pictures at their disposal, for discussion with the management, which took place. The management had known about these photographs since 2008. They also were made aware of many similar observations by others. The press, too, was critical. Yet the Spanish riding school denied and rejected criticism and refused a television crew entrance to training and performances. Several experienced riders have left the institution in recent years. They were not prepared to fast-track sloppy training, to watch the excessive demands on man and horse without criticism, or to align themselves to the planned convergence with modern competitive riding. 2 chief riders were released from duty on full pay. From 2006 to 2012, the head of the riding school was Ernst Bachinger, a controversial equestrian, past pension age, with close connections to competitive riding. The system thrives on a predetermined cycle of horse and rider training, according to the nature and personality of the horse, whereby the young continue to learn from the old and experienced. Were this cycle of human and equine teachers to be broken, the consequences for the training would be disastrous. There are now young riders who dissuade their private students from reading the works of Kurt Albrecht, Alois Podolsky, and Hans Handel, arguing that these prominent representatives of the traditional Viennese teaching are outdated. We would ride differently today. In place of the classical horsemanship that they hope to achieve, with subtle assistance, private students report inferior competitive equestrianism, with the use of hyperflexion.
End of January 2010, there was an uproar in Austria. In an open letter, addressed to the Austrian State Minister Niki Berlakovic, friends of the Spanish riding school have expressed their concern that due to economy measures, there was supposed overload of the school stallions, and the off-duty placement of 2 out of 4 chief riders. In the open letter, published end of January 2010, which was signed among others by the former head of the Spanish riding school Dr. Jeremiah Ullela, quote, failures due to lameness up to injuries with the stallions, depreciation of the classical performance, and a deterioration within the, up to now matchless, quality concerning precision, brilliancy, and classiness of the performance, which among others are thought to be caused by the cuts, and by doubling the performance dates. By this, the stallions are overloaded, and the time for necessary corrections of the individual program points is limited. Moreover, it has to be mentioned that 2 highly qualified senior chief riders, out of a total of 4, were put off duty. By this, the verbal transmission of the knowledge of the classical directives onto younger riders, like Alevis and junior riders, is considerably limited and in danger. Close quote.
Critical concerned reports came to a head on the internet, when in May 2014, the Spanish riding school announced that the Dutch dressage rider, Ankie van Grunsven, would present 2 gala performances in Amsterdam, in November this year. Horse friends were shocked by such an alliance with one of the representatives of horse abusive Rollkur. They were dismissed with the terse message that the Spanish riding school had no influence on the presenter of a foreign show. In 2014, after some media, worrying about bad performing of the Spanish riding school, published, next to others, my photos from 2008, the use of LDR, Rollkur, hyperflexion trainings techniques, was violently disregarded. Quote, "If a rider would do so, he would be dismissed." Close quote. The published photos from 2008 were considered stretching exercises not being used in movement, as Mrs. Gertler said.
International criticism is now pounding on the Lipizzaner boss, Mrs. Gertler. The famous Viennese institution is accused of torturous methods in dressage, the Courier reported. On the 7th of July 2015, the focus is on the so-called Rollkur. HYPERFLEXION, its official name, originally comes from France and is mainly used in the Netherlands. Pictures of the Dutch horse expert Ulrike Thiel, from a morning training session in May 2008, are supposed to show that this controversial measure was obviously also used in the riding school. Gertler definitely denied this to the Courier. But Christine Aurich, university professor at the Veterinary Medicine Vienna and author of a study on this controversial trainingsmethod, says without a doubt, the photos clearly show the classic Rollkur. According to Thiel, the consequences of this can be seen in the movements of the horses in current photos and videos, for example on this year's Lipizzaner Tour in April in Malmö, Sweden. University expert Aurich also says, the animals must have been ridden there with force and are overwhelmed. These are not the images of the beautiful art of riding, as preached at the Spanish riding school.
Interrogated in this television program, Mrs. Gertler also stated that, if she had videos showing riders of the SRS practicing hyperflexion, she would fire the riders in question immediately.
Das ist ein Bild aus dem Stand, das ist nicht in der Bewegung, das ist eine Momentaufnahme, wo dieses Pferd nach rechts abbiegt, aber das hat mit Tierquälerei nichts zu tun, sondern er versucht hier die linke Seite des Halses zu dehnen. Ich glaube.
She forgot to mention that the SRS itself produced a film about their tour 2014-15, in which the LDR, Rollkur, hyperflexion training was shown by several riders for a longer time in motion, and the consequences of this training were very clearly documented in the movement patterns of the stallions during the performances, also shown in his same video production.
The SRS published the videos in 2015 for public use on their FB page and via YouTube. They commented April 28, 2015, quote, "Certain pictures currently being circulated on the internet accuse the riders of the Spanish riding school of a riding style viewed as harmful to horses." The photos referred to have been taken from a documentary produced by Horse and Country TV in cooperation with the riders of the Spanish riding school. It was produced in 2014 during a tour to Malmö and has been broadcasted several times. If you have a look at the complete film, you will reach the conclusion that these accusations made against the Spanish riding school are unsustainable. The recently circulated pictures are snapshots taken from a slow-motion sequence of the documentary for the purposes of creating a negative impression and have nothing to do with reality. Someone deliberately searched through the slow-motion sequences and picked out the frames that give the impression of a negative riding style. If you watch the complete sequences, you would notice that they display the normal lowering and stretching of the horse's neck. The mere fact that the film was produced in close cooperation with the riders makes it clear that it does not show an improper riding style. On the contrary, it shows the proper education and work with the horses, to which we attribute great value. Therefore, we reiterate that the accusations of the use of hyperflexion are unsustainable. Spanish Riding School, Federal Stud Piber, close quote.
The SRS had not only provided the proof that they had abandoned the path of classic riding and their own directives in favor of modern, dubious methods, and that also the so-called modern dressage had obviously been chosen as the new path, and thus also the new goal of the Spanish riding school in Vienna. In today's it is unbelievable that a dressage method recently has been propagated that demands literal, blind obedience, even though such training is in every way against the nature of the horse. In this method, the horse, which is by nature a flight animal, has no means of evasion, no possibility of escaping the predator in the saddle. In nature, a horse balances himself up and out. That means he carries his neck as a balancing rod high and proud or long and stretched to the ground with its nose in front of the vertical. This can be seen out in the pasture. Classical training uses these natural neck positions, offering the horse the chance to use its neck for balance, also when ridden. Training with the head on the chest, on the other hand, creates fear, tension, loss of trust, and ultimately physical and psychological damage. The FEI looks on without action. Even worse, many medals are given to horses trained in such a torturous way. It makes the training of a dressage horse into a farce, when a horse, so trained, is proclaimed the happiest horse of the year. The Dutch dressage riders dominated the European Championship in 2009 at the British Windsor and cleaned up in gold medals. They used this manner of riding, which they called the New Dutch School. Since this method, which isn't limited to Dutch riders, is continually criticized, the promoters try to not only justify this training method, but also to represent it as another, modern way of training the sport horse. They describe their school as a new revolutionary riding method, with the extraordinary claim of bringing psychology, natural horsemanship and science together. They suggest that their method represents a further evolution of the classical, horse-friendly riding culture. In actuality, it is far from the intentions and results of the classical teachings that are still the basis for today's national and international dressage sport. If you study their method from the standpoint of the horse, it is not another, shorter or more efficient way to roam, but rather a path with a different goal. I am reminded of the famous drawing of Horse Heaven, with the Duke of Newcastle. He was a Baroque English horse trainer, who was very taken with himself. He is credited with having invented the draw reins, and dominated all of his horses in a manner we would now refer to as predatory. In one of his books he had himself drawn in Horse Heaven, with all the horses he had trained, honoring and practically praying to him. The motto, "He who dominates, is beloved," was coined here more than 300 years ago. Even he tried to justify the exploitation of horses for the satisfaction of personal vanity as Horse Heaven. The school which propagates LDR, low, deep and round riding, doesn't just use an unnatural overflexed posture, it relies on the total domination of the horse. Here is a typical picture of the modern riding school in a test. The back is dropped, there is absolute elevation, no bending of the haunches, and a tail swishing in agitation.
The former chief rider, Klaus Krisisch, is a pronounced opponent of the new system, and sees the level of the Spanish riding schools seriously endangered. In an interview in 2015 with Pro Pferd, an Austrian online horse magazine, he explained why the excessive demands on horses undermine the classic training system. Quote, "In the last few years, a tried and tested system, that was decades old, has been destroyed and replaced by a new one, which, however, cannot work." Mrs. Gertler believed she had to push the institute into the profit zone with one step, almost double the performances, and set up a second set for tours. All of this ultimately leads to excessive demands on the horses, which makes classic riding and training impossible. The 7 or 8 minutes that a program item lasts don't really exhaust the horses excessively, but in order to be able to perform 8 minutes at this level, it takes years of intensive training, and Mrs. Gertler forgets that in her calculation. If I have a Grand Prix horse today, it will take me around 4 years to even get the horse to this level, and another 2 years to fine-tune the details. It's not about the 8 minutes of performance, but the years of work before that, which is a considerable burden for the horses. And unfortunately that usually gets lost in public discussion. When a ski racer goes down the strafe, it only takes 2 minutes, but what is ahead of this performance? How many years of hard training? How much effort and how much sweat? Not only has the number of performances almost doubled, but also the entire scope of training. We used to have around 170 training days a year, now there are around 250. We have already gone through all of this under Albrecht. Even then the number of performances was increased to around 70. But it soon became clear that this was not just for the health of the horses, but also bad for the level of the performances. At that time, however, they were still responsible enough to end this experiment quickly. Real horse people were still in charge at that time. Rollkur is a problem in several ways. First, because it is against the nature of the horse. Classical riding is nothing more than working out and presenting the natural movements of the horse. If you look at the young stallions in Piber in the paddock, you will see canter changes, traversals, passage or passage-like steps, when the young stallions demonstrate their impressive demeanor and lift their tail, or they show piaffe kicks, or stand up like a courbet. All of this is classic. I can derive all these lessons from the natural movements, up to the airs above the ground, and cultivate and refine them, as it were. For me, it's a circus. When you let a horse do 8 or 10 courbet jumps, when it has to lie down or sit down, etc., that has nothing to do with traditional equestrianism. The Rollkur is against the nature of the horse, and therefore has no place in classical riding. A horse's head and neck are its balance bar, and the horse is best balanced then, in all lessons, when it is just before the vertical. That was always the case in classical equestrianism, and luckily you are now discovering it again in dressage. What I cannot accept is the trainings technique, in which the horse is more or less subordinated, and also tortured by an unnatural forced posture. And unfortunately, this bad habit has found its way into the Spanish riding school, as many photos, and even videos show. If these are described by Mrs. Gertler as snapshots, and by Mr. Dobritzberger as stretching exercises, then I think that's just so dishonest that I have no words for. Perhaps I can tell a layperson that, but anyone who has a little knowledge of riding knows what's going on and what is being done with the horses. The fact is that riders practice the Rollkur at the Spanish riding school. The Austrian writer and horse lover, Daniela Striegel, wrote in 2011 in the Viennese weekly magazine, Der Folter, a weekly view of politics, media, culture, and life in Vienna, and later in the German magazine Die Welt, about her observations and thoughts around the developments of the last years in the Spanish riding school, entitled White Horses Black Times. Lame Lipizzaners, desperate riders, faulty restructuring of the Spanish riding school result in alarming consequences. Quote, the saying, speed kills, is also true for equestrianism. The Spanish riding school was always proud of its great caution, and how slowly it trained both people and animals. The Lipizzaner is a late maturing and long-lived breed. In the Spanish riding school he works to an age of 26 or 27. Today, not even the active chief riders have all the airs above the ground, the famous porcelain figure of the levade, and the jumps, courbette and capriole, in their repertoire. And most riders are not qualified to train their horses in all paces and movements, like piaffe, passage and canter pirouette. The restructure failed primarily because it put in jeopardy what the Special Spanish Riding School Act defined as target of the transfer to one legal public company, in addition to the traditional breeding of Lipizzaners. The preservation of the tradition and the high school of classical horsemanship. Afterwards, the management board, the unattainable fetish of black figures in front of their eyes, brazenly surrendered principles, little by little, one at a time. In SPI, T of all the lip service. With the spin-off in 2001, however, the weighting changed, not least because the riding school entered the race with the Piber handicap. Joseph II had to realize that a stud cannot be run for a profit. In the past it was primarily a matter of working on the worldwide unique level of the horse ballet, of maintaining tradition, and passing on knowledge to the next generation by means of oral directives. And merchandising revenues are becoming increasingly important. More and more people took the Lipizzanas on the commercial curb, and degraded them to advertising message carriers and tourist milking cows. Today they can't drop a Ross apple without some gilders throwing in. Morning work with music, a visit to a foal from Piber, on turf in the Vienna Bergardens, alpine lift as a staging. In 2007, Elisabeth Gertler was appointed managing director by Agriculture Minister Erwin Proll. The boss of the Hotel Sacher, previously also the organizer of the Vienna Opera Ball, recommended herself, on the one hand, as the high priestess responsible for national shrines. On the other hand, she enjoys the reputation of an iron lady. Quantity instead of quality is now the trend. Expansion instead of tradition, advertising instead of dignity, circus instead of art. The number of screenings per year has increased, from around 45 public to 75 in the end, as well as private appearances and tours. The holidays of the school stallions, comparable to high-performance athletes, were extremely shortened. A second touring team is to be set up, albeit with the 13 existing riders. Finding sufficiently talented stallions is proving to be difficult, and this year there were only 31 foals in Piber, more than ever before. While the Circle of Friends of the Spanish Riding School criticizes all of this, Mrs. Gertler and her Friends of the Spanish Riding School, including Olympic champion Sissi Max Thura, deny that the horse and rider are overburdened, and that the horses are by no means sick or lame more often. The loss of level is also a maliciously spread untruth. That this is not the case is something everyone can see. not only at the Winter Riding School of Emperor Charles VI, but also based on several recordings on the net. There is a lack of perfection, elegance, and harmony between rider and horse, for which one is world famous. The school quadrille, once the highlight of the program, has been shortened by half. The distances and lines are not exact, as can be seen by any layperson. The gaits are not adhered to by all 8 horses. Piaffe, passage, pirouette at a gallop, and a flying change of canter leave you lacking security and momentum. The performance of the schools above the ground, which can be traced back to Xenophon's About the Art of Riding, the well-known porcelain figure of the levade, and the school jumps, courbette and capriole, sometimes even fails miserably. No wonder. There are currently only 2 chief riders available for the training of stallions and riders. 3 of the internationally sought-after top experts have been sent for a walk in recent years with regular payments, because they opposed the decreed changes, including the incumbent chief rider Klaus Krisisch, for whom the management team with Ernst Bachinger had put a head of the riding arena in front of his nose, whose riding skills are controversial. It doesn't just happen. It's called politics. Elizabeth Gertler, frankly, lets her interlocutor know that level M, medium, dressage training is always sufficient for the stallions. The tourists would not notice the difference anyway. That sounds a bit as if one would forego the high C in the Vienna State Opera, due to the lack of trained listeners' ears. Incidentally, this view from the high horse also violates the spirit of the Riding School Act, which demands the preservation of tradition and the high school of classical riding art, which is primarily an art and only therefore also a tourist attraction. In 2010, the Spanish Riding School of Vienna was included in the UNESCO list of Austria's intangible cultural heritage. This heritage has never been as threatened as it is now. In any case, the spin-off also failed economically, with an accumulated deficit of €24 million. If you consider that, according to a study, Austria owes the Lipizzaner image an annual turnover of an estimated 120 million, then the additional state subsidy of 1 to 2 million per annum, demanded by experts, would not only be right, but even cheap. Close quote. Martin Haller in a guest comment in Profear.at, an Austrian equine online magazine, in January 2019. The Spanish riding school can no longer be a political plaything. Quote, in classical Greek tragedy, the terrible end is always inevitable, and a necessary stylistic device, to add the compelling, logical, instructive end to the piece. The viewer should recognize that human misconduct inevitably leads to the abyss, and the imperfect, driven person has no way out. Fortunately, it is not quite as blatant when a little tragedy takes place in the waltz town, on the blue edge of the Danube, or a minor god is offended. However, it is noteworthy again and again what echo a replacement of top positions in the riding school or in Piper evokes. We remember, with a shudder, the years of struggles and cramps in the media for off-duty superiors, overburdened stallions, endless gossip with critics, and the endless and ultimately fruitless discussion about the supposed or actually declining quality of the performances. All of this happened against the background of a consciously induced uncertainty, triggered by the so-called spin-off in 2001, which brought with it the threat of bankruptcy, personal quarrels, loss of tradition and a weak staffing level. Back then, with, you can only call it that, a typical Austrian instinct for self-destruction initiated a tragedy that is now heading towards its next act. At the moment, a decision is being made again, and certainly not for the last time, on the basic orientation of the Spanish. Will she be given the inner security that is absolutely necessary so that she can find her way out of the valley of tears of the last decades? Or does she have to tumble on until the logical end of every tragedy? No personal guilt is to be postulated here. Probably none of the relevant parties involved knowingly or intentionally caused a single major catastrophe in the past 17 years. It was just that no one was willing, or able, to do, or demand, what is true and right with all their might, or even just say it out loud, as is unfortunately common in politics. If we multiply that by 20 or 30 people, management, leadership in PIBA, advisory board, ministry, rider, etc., then we have the cast for a predictable drama. There has been so much talk, and so little said about the female title role of the past few years, that it is pointless to boil the old brew again. She was undoubtedly a strong, energetic personality, who probably didn't always make the right decisions, but who would have stood up to her. Their henchmen were the usual characters: compliant, uncritical, arbitrary, or beneficial. Some are certainly still there, and will remain so, others not. The victims, in any case, the horses, because apparently nobody really lives up to them anymore, because, as not only former chief riders believe, they are no longer trained according to the strict classical rules, and have been made into distortions of their true art. The same applies to the riders, because for years, they have been sworn by ailing priests to false idols, because they are accused of mistakes, for which they are not solely responsible. They were not allowed to be told what their right to know was: the truth. Some of them guessed it, were smart enough to recognize their own weaknesses, but they too were kept quiet. The last two chief riders, with enough ego to defend themselves against the great nothingness, have been so thoroughly retired that a reconciliation in case of need remains questionable. Should, as it becomes apparent in new press reports, a new commitment from head rider Johann Riegler should appear, it would be a positive sensation. Only someone like Riegler could manage to clear out the Augier's stables, provided that he is given all the skills he needs, and is ready to follow him into a phase of reconstruction, because those clear, simple structures in schools and stud farms, which in the times of Podolsky, Handler, or Albrecht ensured equestrian quality, and at least external harmony, are unfortunately long history. It was probably the original sin to turn the riding school and the stud into a political plaything through the spin-off, which aroused enormous desires and has only produced ever-increasing chaos since 2001. A nearly 500-year-old Academy of Fine Arts must not have anything to do with politics, either actively or passively, and must be able to work freely, independently, and economically safely, using the positive forces of perseverance, working out of inner conviction, and not at the request of the outside world, knowing about one's own past and responsibility, These are the qualities that one needs here and now. Hysterical profit optimization and applause-seeking media noise are disturbing and dangerous. They confuse and obscure the goal. That is anchored in law and means to preserve the classic art of riding and the Lipizzaner horse, and not to appear, as often as possible, in a popular short format of the ORF, the Austrian television company. The conclusion of the author, in January 2019, was: too many insufficiently knowledgeable people have messed around with something that could be quite simple, and it actually was before 2001. They provided each other, or themselves, with positions and presumably also amenities, with colorful things that were of little use to the Spanish, and were unnecessary for the welfare of the horses and the care of the art of riding. Too few people, who knew better, were asked for honest and constructive information, and those who said so, without being asked, have been silenced with seldom sharpness. Hardly anyone wanted, was able or allowed to tell the truth, which is actually astonishingly banal. What do the Lipizzaners really need? No more than a handful of officials who anonymously take care of their safety and equipment in ministerial silence. To do this, they would absolutely have to be transferred to the culture department, and be firmly anchored there again as a state enterprise. A capable stud director, with a lot of personal responsibility in PYBA, who makes sure that there are enough good horses, because that's where everything starts. Furthermore, an energetic leader in Vienna, who rides or is ridden excellently, who can ride best in the demonstrations, and who first and foremost ensures that around 15 riders do what they are in the world for, namely to ride correctly according to classical guidelines on 70 or 75 stallions. All those involved then only have to diligently and honestly serve the beauty of the horse from 6 a.m. to 1 p.m. at their workplace. It never needed more. If you compare it with a Saka cake, you could say that the more chefs keep adding new ingredients to it, you could say that it doesn't get any better. If you change something in a perfectly classic recipe, you mean to destroy it. Your Martin Haller. Close quote.
Sylvia Locke, well-known classical trainer and author, some time ago, wrote in her article, Keeper of the Grail, the Spanish riding school at a time of great change. No one would deny the genuine glamour that competitive dressage enjoys today. But strangely perhaps, it has taken years to motivate the public to want to pay money to watch those slim-thighed young women in top hat and tails, vying with their elegant male counterparts for trophies and points. Amidst the hype, the smell of expensive leather and the creme de la creme of horseflesh, despite the anticipation of the cognoscenti, hushed and scrutinous in the grandstands, somehow, somewhere, as the winner takes all, there is something missing. Yet, amongst the faithful public, who troop time and again to see the Spanish riding school of Vienna, many know little of the intricacies of horses, or indeed of dressage. They go because they are drawn There is something mystical and magnetic about the dancing white stallions. And here, with no prizes to get in the way, people can lose themselves in the real thing. Transported to a world where time stands still. There is the wonder of man and beast working as one. The mutual trust, the respect, built over so many years, shines through the dancing steps, until an almost spiritual merging of body and mind unfolds before their eyes. The centaur comes alive. That vision of unity and union, human and horse, still enjoying the same exercises, the same flowing movement and controlled freedom that has always brought tears to the eyes of all who behold the proud Lipizzan of Vienna in their moment of glory. So the continued existence of the Spanish riding school is vital. Its strength has always lain in its unswerving refusal to break with tradition or to compromise. So how should it tread for the future? Clearly, commercial interests must never be at the expense of excellence, or it will lose the love and support of its greatest admirers. Unless it remains as an exemplar, pure and unsullied, the millions who are drawn there will fade away. In a world where all seems instant, telecommunications, the internet, food, travel, there is a lasting strength about Vienna. People want to be reminded that some things, like a precious work of art, require time, study, method, observation, patience, and feeling. It draws them back to their roots. The traditions laid down both at Piber, the foundation stud for the breeding of the magical Lipizzanas, and at Vienna, the Academy of Riding, will continue to appeal, provided it remains constant and true to itself. Sylvia Locke also wrote a letter to the Austrian federal president, out of concern about the changes at the Spanish riding school. Finally, I am politely allowed to make a personal remark about my encounter with the new Spanish riding school, and why I made this documentation. Since I have been dealing with the effects of non-horse-friendly training methods for years, it was particularly shocking for me when I discovered through personal observation that this very institution makes use of such methods. After I, not being the only one, expressed myself critically, I was sued for omission in 2014 for a critical opinion article in the horse magazine Cavallo by the school's directors before the Vienna Commercial Court. A lengthy, complicated and arduous lawsuit ended 2018 in an agreement, without my having to withdraw a word of my criticism to the training methods used and their effects. As it is also noticeable in sport, many people know that there are fewer and fewer role models for the real classic horse-friendly training path. In addition, no longer is known what the movement pattern and the body expression of the horse looks like in classical horsemanship, and just as little know how you can tell that work is not done according to the rules of classical training. With this modest documentation, I hope to be able to contribute something to making the differences easier to see. And maybe those who haven't noticed before will recognize what has just been lost here in the beautiful Baroque riding arena during the past 20 years. The model for horse-friendly classical riding, in which the horse becomes a joyful, athletic, and wonderful dance partner of his rider, shows the impressed spectator what partnership between horse and human is capable of. I and many others are lucky enough to have seen it with our own eyes, and to be able to keep it in our memory forever. And that is the reason why I put this documentation together. Because classic horse fair and partnership-based horsemanship matters.
Dr. Ulrike Thiel, clinical psychologist, comes from Vienna and is director of the Institute for Equine Therapy and Equestrian Psychology Kranandonk, the Netherlands. She has practiced various branches of equestrian sport herself, is a riding and vaulting trainer, equitherapist, and was a dressage judge for years. She specialized in psychomotor and horsemanship. For many years she has studied the damaging consequences of Rollkur, LDR hyperflexion and absolute elevation on horses' welfare. Her book Being Ridden, Dressage from the Horse's Point of View describes riding as a harmonious dialogue in motion wherein the horse changes from flight animal to man's dance partner. The book would incorporate psychological as well as technical aspects of horse training, including the physical and mental learning processes, which the horse could experience as pleasant or unpleasant. Accordingly, she began the critical study that led to this book on the appropriateness of various training methods. Experience with her students, research and observations at both the top and the bottom of the sport, made it apparent to her that a systematic comparison of how different ways of riding affect the horse would be useful.